Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners, and welcome to this week's podcast.
Hello, everyone. This is an exciting program. Our old friend, Dr. Joseph Ellis, has become a regular. No one could wish the pandemic will last a day longer than it needs to, but we have been so fortunate to have him as a guest because he's sequestered up in Vermont, and I get the sense that he's hungry for talk. He's brought so much light and insight to the Jefferson Hour, and today we talked about the most contested election in American history, certainly one of the top four most contested elections in American history, that of 1800, when Jefferson won narrowly, tied with Aaron Burr, and that threw the election into a constitutional crisis in the Electoral College in the House of Representatives. But David, I mean, what an extraordinary little lesson in electoral history we got from Dr. Ellis today.
Well, from the both of you, don't be so modest, sir. One thing that he did say that really stuck out to me when, I asked him about the effect of political shenanigans going on and whether the public really even was well enough informed during that period of time to react to that sort of press. And he set us straight on that. And it was the high rates of literacy and how fast that sort of news traveled up and down the Atlantic coast, and also the outstanding numbers of voters during that time.
Right. So of white men who had property, the response rate was over 80% of the electors, of the people who were then officially regarded as full citizens. The response was huge back then, and now we're under 50. It's just such a joy to talk to Joe Ellis. He's pretty rough on Jefferson. You don't see me here squirming. But I do disagree with him when he says that the election was bought in New York. It was a carnival, that's for sure. But I don't think that it's quite that. I hate to disagree with Joseph Ellis, but I think that he might have slightly overstated that. But it is the case that Jefferson behaved badly in the election of 1800 and went after Adams through surrogates in a way that must have embarrassed Jefferson. And Abigail Adams threw it back in his face in 1804, and Jefferson had no adequate defense of himself. He said he didn't want power, but he certainly did everything it took to displace John Adams as second president. But Jefferson thought that the future of the republic was at stake, but don't they always? I mean, that's what we're hearing now.
As I said, that the cheap headline would be Jefferson steals the election. Before we go to the show, anything you want to update us on, sir?
A bunch of things. So first of all, my comedy album is out, and people can find it at Spotify and Amazon and iTunes and so on. But it's called Talking Out of Tights. I'm very pleased with that. My new book was published on August 10th, Repairing Jefferson's America, and I'm very excited about that. And I'm still hoping that others who are listening will help to provide the funds. We are providing these books at cost, but provide the funds so that every legislator in America or in your state can have a copy of Repairing Jefferson's America, A Guide to Civility and Enlightened Citizenship. My other book, Bring Out Your Dead, is available on Amazon and Kindle, and it's actually selling really well. It's in the whole course of my life. Then we have a bunch of stuff coming up, David. My Homer course, online, 5 sessions on Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And I know that sounds like heavy sledding to some, but this is your chance to read the Iliad and the Odyssey with someone who loves it right down to his heart. And it'll be great fun. We'll do it on Zoom. So go to Jefferson Hour for that. The winter encampments on one on Thoreau and Whitman, the other on J. Robert Oppenheimer and the making and the use of the atomic bomb. And then in March, there will be the third trip to Monterey and to Bakersfield in the Central Valley, our third John Steinbeck trip, and with any luck, in February, our second trip to Cuba, which was one of the transformative experiences of my adult life. So lots and lots going on. But in the short term, buy books. Thank you. If you do, help us get them into the hands of legislators. The comedy album is there for those who wish to laugh through this very difficult moment. And then the Homer course begins at the end of September, 5 sessions on Saturdays on Zoom. We've done 2 previous courses, one on pandemics and one on the Enlightenment. They've been great hits. We're actually having reunions because people are so happy for thoughtful conversation at this time. And so go to all of those. But I know it sounds like a lot. This is the year of 4 books. In fact, this week, David, I must push send on my big North Dakota book. And I'm scared to death to push send, but I'm going to do it.
Well, with that, once again, I know both of us would like to thank Joseph Ellis for being so generous with his time. The conversations between the two of you are just a delight. So with that, may we go to this week's show, sir?
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to you, David, for brokering these conversations. I know Joseph Ellis calls you 3 or 4 times a week now, and he's
not quite that often, but he's always fun to talk to.
His friend out in Bismarck, North Dakota. So believe me, people, David Swenson does exist. It's not ventriloquism. He's just a shy fellow.
Okay, then, on that note.
Thanks, everyone. Listen to the program.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation about all things Jefferson in American history. I'm your host, David Swenson, and I am joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay Jenkinson, and also Professor Joseph Ellis. And good to talk to the both of you gentlemen. I understand you have a conversation planned about 1800 for us this week.
Yeah, hello to Joe. You're still at an undisclosed location in Vermont, are you not?
I'm up here on the top of the mountain in the Green Mountains in the middle of Vermont, quarantined. And I like your choice of this topic, Clay, 1800 election, because I know most of us are, living lives of not so splendid isolation, and we're looking at the pandemic and the economy on the verge of depression, and an election which threatens to be one of the most controversial and consequential and perhaps dirtiest in American history. And so let's look back at what might very well be, and in my view is, the dirtiest election in American history, which is, you can argue about that. 1824 is dirty with John Quincy and Jackson. 2000 is dirty with Gore and Bush. But I vote for Jefferson against Adams in 1800 as the dirtiest.
Wow, so if that's true, and I'm not doubting you, Jefferson's not going to come off very well in this program because the dirt came much more from Jefferson's side than from Adams' side.
True, but this is not going to be an anti-Jefferson program in the sense that his behavior in this is not perfect by any stretch, but the whole system is what's at fault in this moment. It's the first election where political parties become the main force, and Jefferson knows how to behave within that party context, and Adams doesn't.
So, Joe, I'm going to save this question till the very end, but I want you to be brooding about it, and that is why, and don't answer now, but why is the election of 2020 one of the most consequential in American history? We're going to close the program with that, but here's how I want to start. John Adams becomes the second president of the United States. He was the vice president during the Washington administration, and he actually wrote a letter to Abigail saying, using the term a little loosely, I'm the heir apparent. Here's the question. How long did John Adams expect to serve as the second president of the United States?
8 years. Washington had set the 2-term precedent, and I don't think Adams was going to go against that. But the press suggested that he was going to try to make himself king and appoint his son, John Quincy, his heir apparent. There's no evidence for that. That was just propaganda from the Republican side. So I think he expected to serve for 2 terms, and he only served for 1.
I do think, however, that because this was the beginning, when we were still trying to figure out how the Constitution would operate, these first 2 presidents, Washington and Adams, both at times thought, well, maybe a president doesn't actually need to serve out a full term. He could resign at some point. That the 4-year term hardened in place in the course of American history, but at the beginning there was sort of a sense that, Washington several times wanted to retire during his second term, that the 4-year term was not as determinative as it has since become. But this much is true, isn't it? That Adams did not expect to be displaced after a single term.
Yes, I think you're right. In all of American history, no president in American history did not want to be president more than George Washington. He hated it. And he was always, if you read his correspondence during his 2 terms, half the correspondence is about Mount Vernon. That's what he wants to be there, and under his vine and fig trees. And so he did want to retire early after the first term and then during the second term, so that it was not as clear and precise as it now is in terms of 4 years, 4 years.
Now, we may see this. Let's say that Joe Biden or President Trump is elected in November 2020. These are elderly men. It is not, from an actuarial point of view, altogether clear that either one finishes a term.
I think that's fair. Absolutely.
So back to Jefferson and Adams. So in 1800, Jefferson, in his usual way, says, well, he doesn't really want to be president, and he's responding to the call, and he'd rather be at home, and so on. But he comes like a billiard ball and knocks Adams out of his trajectory. And Adams was a good and decent man, and he loved Jefferson, but he never quite got over that.
It's a very close election.
Very close. I think it was 73 to 65.
And so Jefferson becomes vice president. And this is crucial, in the early presidential elections, because it was pre-party, you didn't vote for two people on a ticket. You voted for two people, period. And whoever got the most votes, electoral votes, was the president, and whoever got the second most was the vice president. And that meant in the election of 1796, Jefferson became Adams's vice president. Jefferson himself said he was relieved not to win because whoever succeeded Washington was in for deep trouble, because nobody was going to be able to succeed him successfully. And so he said, I'm just starting to bone up on Robert's Rules of Order so I can oversee the Senate and do nothing else.
Yeah, the only good thing that Jefferson did as vice president was create a Senate Manual of Procedure, which in some form continues to this day. He wasn't a very loyal vice president. He was no Mike Pence. He was already...
In fact, he was moving behind the scenes to undermine the foreign policy of the Adams administration. And the American ambassador to France was Monroe, and Jefferson would write to Monroe and tell him to tell the French not to pay any attention to what we were doing, because Adams wasn't really a legitimate president, and that eventually he'd replace him. Things which would now be regarded as somewhat treasonable, if not treasonable per se. He hired his own public relations people to go after Adams. No, he was not a loyal vice president. But Adams wins the election and in 1796 and is therefore the heir apparent again, obviously in 1800, and Jefferson is going to be running against them, even though, again, Jefferson claimed he didn't even think he was running. I mean, Madison is working for him in state-by-state basis to get people lined up. And Madison says, I did not go to visit Jefferson, even though he only lived a few miles away at Monticello from Montpelier, because I knew if I talked to him, I'd have to tell him what I was doing. I mean, he'd get very upset. And Jefferson said, I'm just interested in my vet crop and getting my crops in. So he claimed to be totally unaware of the fact that he was a candidate for president of the United States in 1800.
It's always fun to listen to the two of you talk about Jefferson and Adams, particularly you, Professor Ellis. Your book, Founding Brothers, The Revolutionary Generation, you refer to Jefferson and Adams as, quote, the odd couple of the revolution. I thought that was pretty good.
Yeah, they were the one, Benjamin Rush said they were the north and south poles of the American Revolution.
They were Don Quixote and Sancho Panza.
Even Adams said he'd rather be Sancho Panza than Don Quixote, yeah.
So here's my question, Joe. This is a big, big question, but I know you'll find ways to talk about it in the rest of this segment and through the next one. Why did John Adams lose the election of 1800? Why did the incumbent second president of the United States not be reelected by the voters in 1800?
That's actually straightforward. It's not interpretively complicated. In the election of 1796, he won in 1800. He won all the states that he had won in 1796, but he lost New York. And New York had 10 electoral votes. And in 1796, the New York electoral votes were not counted. There was some sort of political or logistical problem, and it didn't count them. And he lost the 10 electoral votes in New York because Aaron Burr bought the New York legislature the preceding spring. He spent $50,000 assuring that there would be a dominant majority of Republicans in the Senate that would then decide on who the electors were. He had met with Jefferson at Monticello a few weeks before that time. We don't know what they said to each other. We do know that he bought the New York legislature and subsequently became the equivalent of Jefferson's running mate. So there was a conspiracy that was succeeded, and the reason that Adams lost is because he lost New York.
But, first of all, that money that Burr spent was not his own. As usual, he was marrying widows and borrowing money and living beyond his means. He was a very interesting character, and Jefferson never really approved of Burr, but he knew that Burr could deliver the state of New York. But there are other reasons why Adams lost the election, and one of them is his response to the quasi-war and the XYZ affair.
That's right. The dominant problem in foreign policy is whether the United States should maintain its long-term alliance with France or whether it should go with England because of their 80% of our trade was with England. The Federalists, Hamilton, Washington, and Adams leaned towards England, and Jefferson and the Republicans towards France, saying that the French Revolution was essentially the European version of the American Revolution. They didn't foresee Napoleon. At any rate, I think that in an attempt to negotiate with the French, the XYZ affair is a deal in which Talleyrand, the French foreign minister, requires us to pay a bribe in order to negotiate. And Adams doesn't do that. He says that's ridiculous. We're not going to do that. But the Republicans play politics with this and say it's Adams's fault, or Adams is secretly wants to have war with France, which he didn't. And so there are crowds outside the presidential mansion in New York, which is still in Philadelphia, I guess by that time. It's Philadelphia, protesting, thousands of people, because most of the population is pro-French. And Adams is attempting to be neutral and attempting to steer clear and to follow Washington's advice in the farewell address and to have no kind of alliance with any European power. Jefferson and the Republicans want us to be allied with France. And I think history shows that Adams was right and Jefferson was wrong on this. But at the moment, Adams's position was extremely unpopular. The fact that it was unpopular didn't make Adams nervous. He thought it was great to be unpopular because it showed clearly that you were not playing politics, that you were doing what was in the public interest, even though at the time popular opinion was quite clearly in the other direction.
Very good, gentlemen. We need to take just a short break. We'll return to this subject in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation about Jefferson and American history. We're joined this week by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and by Professor Joseph Ellis. And if I was going to write a headline for the previous segment, it would probably be something like, Jefferson steals election, New York electors bought and paid for. Am I off base on that?
Jefferson kept his own hands clean. He never gets his hands dirty in that. Somebody else did it for him. But remember, what it produced is a tie. That is to say, Jefferson didn't win outright because the people voted for Jefferson and Burr together, and they both had the same number of electoral votes. And so at the end of the election, nobody knew who the winner was. And according to the Constitution, and this was the first time this happened, it went into the House of Representatives, and each state got one vote. And it's going to take, I think, 40-some ballots before the net result of Jefferson winning the election is clear.
This was a more swashbuckling time. You know, to say that Jefferson bought or that Burr bought New York is a bit of a stretch. Hamilton was maneuvering in a Machiavellian way at the same time.
He was, that's true. He's opposing Adams. Adams' whole cabinet reports directly to Hamilton, and I mean, Hamilton doesn't want Adams to be president. It's multiple chaos, corruption.
That's right. Hamilton does two appalling things at this time, as you know. First of all, I'll get to the big one second, but first of all, he wrote a letter to John Jay after it was clear that Jefferson was going to win New York, but the results had not been tabulated yet, and Hamilton wrote to Governor Jay and said, maybe we want to change the process here because the worst thing that could ever happen is that Jefferson be elected. Why don't we change the mechanism by which the electors are selected in the state of New York? And John Jay, to his credit, refused to play that game, and he actually wrote in the margin of that document, "I do not think that this would be a worthy thing to do." And so Jay was
now. I had forgotten that, but yes.
But the other thing, of course, is the pamphlet. So Hamilton so hates Adams that he writes this long pamphlet, which he pretends is going to remain private, but which is in fact leaked to the public by Aaron Burr, in which Hamilton, who is sort of the philosopher of the Federalist Party, but now in retirement, writes a savage denunciation of the incumbent Federalist president. How can you explain that, Joe?
Hamilton and Adams hated each other because Hamilton couldn't control Adams, and he wanted to control the Federalist Party. And Adams was temperamentally, Vesuvial. And the charge that Hamilton makes in the pamphlet you referred to is that Adams is slightly out of his mind. Franklin made the same charge against Adams. Adams, threw his wig at people during cabinet meetings. He's vulnerable to the charge. I wrote a book on him called Passionate Sage. He is a sage, but he's also a passionate fellow. But there's bad blood between Hamilton and Adams. And if you'll recall that Adams in his autobiography calls Hamilton the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler. What I call the Band of Brothers is a band in which there's a lot of hostility among the brotherhood. Hamilton is one of the people that Adams hates more than anybody else, certainly more than Jefferson.
Did Hamilton really think this thing wasn't going to be leaked to the public?
Don't know. The net effect of his pamphlet was to undermine Hamilton's credibility, because the net result was to say this was crazy. And Adams said, "I will say nothing about it. It will recoil on Hamilton himself," which it pretty much did. Pretty much finished his career. But there's another thing going on here. During the deliberations in the House that's going on to see who wins the presidency, Hamilton supports Jefferson.
Sort of.
Well, he says, Jefferson, we know, has principles different from our own, but at least he has principles. Burr has no principles at all. He is the perfect demagogue. He is the kind of Catiline that Cicero warned against. And this is going to be one of the main reasons why Burr challenges him to a duel 3 or 4 years later. This is the beginning of the hostility there, because he's challenging Burr's character, not just his own political values.
Yeah, it's a great moment. And, I've read that document by Hamilton many times. He says, well, Jefferson is no great lover of the truth, and he's duplicitous, and he's an intellectual voluptuary, and he's too Frenchified, and he's tinctured with radicalism, but he's better than Burr. And so he damns Jefferson before deciding that he's the lesser of two evils.
He's the enemy we can know, rather than Burr, who, is the ultimate demagogue.
Let's make sure our audience understands this part of it, Joe. Campaigning in 1800. So this year is an exception, but normally in a presidential year, you have 2 whopping conventions, you have primaries, then the candidates fly all over the country and beat their breast and do rallies and take in millions of dollars and are on every media outlet in the country and are making phone calls to try to get more funds from key donors. And it's a circus from around January 1st of the previous year until the election finally occurs on the 4th year. None of that was in place in this era. How did they campaign?
They didn't. In fact, if you actively campaigned on your own behalf, you were demonstrating you're unworthy to serve. So there are people that can campaign for you, and Madison was the guy that did that for Jefferson, but you're not allowed to campaign because it's unbecoming, and a man of virtue does not do that. To do so in the founding era is to confess you're unworthy to serve.
And so Madison did campaign for Jefferson, but he never left his house. And Adams is the incumbent, and if it would have offended Jefferson to campaign actively, it would have killed Adams. This is just something that a man of virtue could not stomach. Yeah. But Jefferson had his coadjutors, especially Madison, but Callender, he had a range of people writing for him. Adams did not coordinate his campaign in quite the way that Jefferson did, but he did have his zealots who were out there attacking Jefferson.
Yeah, there's some Scottish guy. You maybe remember his name. He's writing on the Adams side. Adams later on in his life, he's asked about this, and he said, "I never knew this guy." He says, "I wouldn't recognize him if he appeared in my porridge bowl." And but there were people doing propaganda on Adams' side too, and it's all dirty. It's really dirty. On the Jeffersonian side, they're trying to say that Adams is mentally incompetent, that he wants to make his son the next president. He's the only president up until I don't know when. Maybe it's John Quincy who has a male heir. Nobody else has a male heir, and so he's vulnerable to that. And John Quincy's a prominent figure, so he's vulnerable to that. And he's gonna, he's made a deal to bring prostitutes over to inhabit what we'll later call the White House. That all kinds of crazy stories.
Crazy stories in politics. I guess nothing new. It still happens. I think in terms of then and now, which is kind of what the Jefferson Hour does. Nowadays, we live in an age of instant communications. Everything is available instantly. Back then, they had no internet. They didn't have this instant news. How did people find out about this? And if they did it have any effect on how they voted?
Yeah, I had students over the years when I taught undergraduates for 40 years or so. How come they learned anything? They didn't have the internet. And other people would also say to me, were you alive during the Revolution? Did Ronald Reagan write the Bill of Rights? And so the level of ignorance out there is incredible. But I've always been baffled by the speed of communication in the 18th century, both during the Revolution itself and then in the founding era afterwards. It's almost it's pamphlets, and which are kind of early day blogs. They move with electrical speed up and down the Atlantic coast. They get picked up by newspapers. There's 152 newspapers, and it's difficult to get things across the Atlantic, but not up and down the Atlantic coast. So that, and I actually, one of the thoughts I had was that people read then. People, the literacy rate in New England was about 95%, less in the South, but. That if you try to get them to read, say, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, today's students have a hard time reading that. Then it was popular; it sold 50,000 copies. Then later, 150,000. So that it's a literate public, newspapers, and it's politically people vote. Again, women couldn't vote, and people without property couldn't vote. But among the eligible voters, there's a turnout rate of about 85 to 90%. The turnout rate in the average presidential election in our time is 52%.
So, Joe, the public is aware of at least this much. Adams, I'm going to caricature it, but Adams tilts more to England. Jefferson tilts more to France. Adams is a Federalist. Jefferson is a Republican. Adams is more associated with the New England economy, with commerce, with fisheries, and so on. Jefferson is a country agrarian. Jefferson is, on the other hand, regarded in many circles as an atheist and a freethinker and an infidel, whereas Adams is regarded as okay on Christianity, one of us. Jefferson, the Sally Hemings story had not yet broken, but there were some kind of rumblings coming out of Virginia that there were irregularities in Jefferson's life. That never happened with Adams. There was no sense of irregularity in his private life. So the public has some awareness of all of this. I mean, they're not, watching Fox and MSNBC 20 hours a day, but the public is aware of the choice that they're making.
I'll add one rather important variable to the excellent list you've just given us, and that is Adams believes we're a nation and that the federal government embodies the nation. Jefferson believes we're a confederation of sovereign states, and that the federal government, in terms of domestic policy, is a foreign government. And he writes in the Kentucky resolutions prior to his election that if legislation passes at the federal level that the inhabitants of a particular state object to, they can simply nullify it. And if they're pressured, they can. The word he used is scission, meaning secession, that they can secede from the Union. So that Jefferson's position is very much similar to the position of the Confederacy in 1860. But he never believes that the United States is a nation. It is a confederation of sovereign states provisionally united in this union, which has some implications for conduct of foreign policy, but none for domestic policy.
Right. So, as you know, in recent historiography, this difference, that Jefferson is an advocate for a confederacy and that he always regarded his country as Virginia, not the United States. But that's increasingly seen as a kind of a paranoid defensive posture to protect slavery, that these Southerners were just absolutely appalled by the thought that a national government might intrude into their peculiar institution of slavery, and that this is all really more defensive than it is, strictly speaking, ideological. What do you think?
I think that's true for later with people like John C. Calhoun, but it's not true for Jefferson. And I've gotten into arguments with people about this, but I once was asked to review the Jefferson Madison 3-volume correspondence, and a lot of it covers this period we're talking about right now in the 1790s. There's never a place where they say, oh, by the way, the reason we are strongly in favor of states' rights is to protect slavery. They never say that. Jefferson really believes that the government from afar is a replication of Parliament's power over us that we attempted to do away with in the war, and that any kind of powerful consolidated federal government is therefore the repudiation of the values of 1776. And that's his dominant position. Now, later on, it's pretty clear that there's perfect correlation between that states' rights position and the need to protect slavery. But I don't think that that's Jefferson's motives in the moment we're discussing now.
So, Joe, in 1798, we're in this quasi-war with France, and Adams' administration passes the Alien Sedition and Naturalization Acts, and the Sedition Act in particular really becomes a flashpoint of national controversy. And the Jeffersonians, the small R Republicans, see this as one of their tickets back to power, and they make the most of it.
And they're right about that, yeah.
Madison writes the Virginia resolutions, Jefferson writes the Kentucky resolutions, both secretly. And so this becomes a rallying cry. When Jefferson does become president, he immediately releases from jail all the people who were imprisoned by the Sedition Act, and he remits their fines. How big a deal was this in terms of a flashpoint policy question in that election?
It was really big. You're correct to say that. Adams rued the day he signed it. It wasn't his initiative. It was the Hamiltonian wing of the Federalist Party that wanted to push this. Now, as we say, the press is really, we think the press, the dialogue on the internet now is pretty extreme, but it was really extreme at that time. And the things that were being said about Adams and about all political candidates were really off the table. And there's this one guy down in New Jersey has a weekly newspaper called, interestingly, The Wasp, and he prints a story saying that Adams is a big ass because he has a big ass, and they prosecute him under the Sedition Act. And Abigail says to John, "Look, under the Alien and Sedition Act, truth is a defense. And I must tell you, John, you do have a big ass."
No, does she really?
By the way, the Alien and Sedition Act is infamous in American history on civil rights issues. Anybody looking back sees it's a weak moment. It's like the Red Scare and McCarthyism, the first version of that. But interestingly, truth is a defense. That is, if you're accused of sedition and you can show that what you're saying is true, you're not guilty. In English law, if, for example, you say the king is crazy, and the king really is crazy, and George III isn't crazy, but he's losing his mind for physical reasons. If it's true, it's worse. The penalty's worse. So it sets a precedent of truth for defense in English law in one of the worst examples of all time, the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Did Abigail really write that letter and say you have a big posterior?
Yeah.
Wow.
She doesn't say posterior. She says ass.
Wow.
And I thought that was really great. But he, in the correspondence with Jefferson later in their twilight years, Adams tries to say, look, Jefferson, you're just as much responsible for the Alien and Sedition Acts as me.
You signed it.
Vice President, and you signed them too.
He must have known that wasn't a...
That's a false argument.
He must have known that was a specious attack.
I agree. Yeah, I completely agree. But I think that the Federalists handed the Republicans an incredibly potent issue with the Alien and Sedition Acts, and that, interestingly, and Jefferson was consistent on this, and he said the federal government does not have the power to do this. The way Madison handled it in the Virginia resolutions is to say, that's right, because it's a violation of your First Amendment rights. And I know something about the First Amendment since I happened to write it. And if you need a decision on this, it should go to the Supreme Court. He foresees judicial review, whereas Jefferson says the states can simply secede. And the Kentucky legislature drops that out erases it so that it's not associated with Jefferson.
We need to take a short break, gentlemen, and maybe have just a moment to contemplate the actual size of Mr. Adams' posterior and his wife's comment on it. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Our favorite guest, Dr. Joseph Ellis at his undisclosed cabin. All right, back to this question now. So to wrap up the Sedition Act. So the Alien Act says that aliens, people say from France or from Haiti, who are considered undesirable, can be banished from this country without any effective due process. The Naturalization Act raised from 5 to 14 years the number of years a new immigrant needed to be here before they could become a full citizen of the United States. And the Sedition Act essentially said that it was illegal to criticize the administration of the government of the United States. And a number of people were, in fact, tried and convicted under the Sedition Act. It led eventually to the impeachment of Justice Samuel Chase, which was an unsuccessful attempt by Jefferson to even the score. But Jefferson said these laws, Joe, the Alien Act, the Sedition Act, and the Naturalization Act, were worthy of the 9th or 10th centuries. How could a man as extraordinarily shrewd and small R Republican as John Adams have let himself be drawn into that set of legislation?
He asked himself that question throughout the rest of his life. There's no answer. It was an initiative by the Federalists in Congress who were under the control of Hamilton. He just let it go, and he signed it, in part because they were going after him in a kind of unfair way, but he regretted it. And whereas he regretted it afterwards, I will call your attention to the fact that Jefferson, when president, while he's opposed to the federal government filing charges against members of the press for criticism, he himself allows and encourages state governments to do just the same thing.
Well, he wrote to McKean, the governor of Pennsylvania, and said a few wholesome prosecutions at the state level would not be disagreeable to me.
That's right. That's right. And, well, he especially hates the New England states because there's Calvinist ministers up there and preaching against him and stuff. And so that Jefferson's own portfolio on civil rights isn't as impeccable as some people believe.
No, there's Leonard Levy's famous book, Jefferson and Civil Liberties, which was as you remember, that book shocked the Jefferson world when it was published, because back then you weren't allowed to criticize Jefferson.
Correct.
That's all changed. Back to the Alien Sedition and Naturalization Act for just one more second. Jefferson secretly writes the Kentucky resolutions. If that had been known, if it could have been proved in the run-up to the election of 1800 that Jefferson was the author of those notorious resolutions, which were widely condemned throughout the United States, would he have been elected?
Yeah, he'd have been elected anyway, I think, because it was rigged. I mean, it wouldn't have made any difference in the New York vote. I don't think it would have made a difference in the election. Later on, the southern states in South Carolina are attempting to do nullification under Jackson's presidency. They all claim, Calhoun claims that they're just echoing Jefferson's position. And Madison defends Jefferson, said sometimes Jefferson speaks in terms that he regrets too. It's true, though. I mean, Jefferson's position is very similar to Calhoun's position. I think that it's not the greatest moment for either Jefferson or Adams, right?
But Jefferson was right and the Adams administration wrong about that trilogy of laws. That's for certain.
Yeah.
And you're saying that it had an effect, but it probably wasn't the determinative issue in the election of 1800.
That's what I think.
And you do really think, in your soberest mind, that that election was in some sense stolen because of Burr's machinations in the state of New York?
Yes. If he had the New York votes, or half the New York, if he had half the New York votes, he would have won.
As you know, there are other people, and Gary Wills is among them, who have argued that Jefferson was president because of the 3/5 clause, and they have called him derisively the Negro president, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And
that did make a difference because the Electoral College granted, because the blacks counted 3/5 in the southern states with huge black populations. It amplified the size of the electorate from the South. If you didn't have the 3/5 clause, Jefferson would have lost.
Joe, you're sort of shattering my image of Jefferson that Clay has taught me about, this man of humility who really didn't want to serve but would if he was called upon. The way you're telling it, Jefferson was power hungry.
Well, I mean, Adams, when Jefferson retired to Monticello, Adams said, "It's interesting how plants grow in the shade." Jefferson couldn't, Washington had the same problem. They couldn't face their own ambitions, and so they always attempted to convince themselves that they were not ambitious. They were. Of course they were. And so was Adams. And while I understand that this sort of godlike view of Jefferson or Washington is going to suffer once we understand them in their full humanity, I think that it's like when you realize that your father had an affair with somebody when he was still married to your mother. And that happens. Get over it. He's still one of the greatest leaders in American history.
It was a whole new set of ambitions, though. I mean, they created the opportunity for it themselves.
Well, Adams was comfortable with power in a way that Jefferson pretended not to be.
I think that's true. I mean, Adams is more honest with himself than Jefferson is. Adams kept a diary. Jefferson never kept a diary. He thought it was an act of self-indulgence, but, you don't really know he didn't want you to know what he was really thinking.
That's it. That's my point, is that Jefferson, you say this in your book, American Sphinx, the character of Thomas Jefferson, that Jefferson was a very complex human being, and he was actually able to convince himself that he was telling the truth when it's palpable that he wasn't. And so when he says he has no ambition, he meant it. He's not doing that. He's not throwing up a public screen.
Yeah, he means it. He means it. And in 1808, at the end of his second term, he really does mean it.
But he always means it. It's not a smoke screen, but at the same time, there's another Jefferson that has to inhabit the same zip code. And this is like an incredibly adroit political strategist who knows exactly how to make things move his way and can enlist people like Madison and Monroe and others to do his wet work for him, and then can live in denial that that very wet work is being done on his behalf. What is that about Jefferson that he can... You said in your book, he created some walls in his own consciousness, and he was able to live on either side of those walls with a seeming integrity.
He's wired so that there are two main lines of communication, and they never connect. That they never interact with one another. And I think that it's a very effective creation, but I think that how do you explain that? I think that one of the arguments that I would make, and this would be true of Madison as well as Jefferson, if you grow up in the slaveholding South, you learn to think and even write in ways that are sometimes elliptical, because you don't want to confront the elephant in the room, and that's slavery. There's a lie at the center of your existence, and you're dependent on it. And how do you deal with that? Well, you create syntaxes that are, this is what Madison does. I tell you, reading the Madison letters like reading the fine print of an insurance policy. And but there is this psychological, mental, and emotional complexity that gets created in that Southern context that allows people to function at the public level in a way that is not completely connected to their private level. And Jefferson's the master of that.
There's a lie at the center of their lives. That's so damaging, but so important.
Well, that's the reason Jefferson's the most resonant figure in American history, because there's a lie at the center of American history. And that's slavery and racism. And Jefferson occupies both sides of that equation.
So we're going to run out of time, and I wish we didn't. We can come back to this, but the election of 1800, so it didn't operate in the same way. And here's one of the important facts about that, Joe. As you know, today, on November 3rd, 2020, we'll have an election, and theoretically, the next day we'll know what happened. In Jefferson's time, there was no single national day of voting. These things dribbled in. It took a long time. The Electoral College eventually met. No one was quite sure. It was very much less determinative in Jefferson's and Adams' era.
There's a much longer gap between the election and the inauguration. And that didn't change until FDR in the 1930s. So you get this long gap. It's during that time, by the way, that Adams appoints the so-called midnight judges, meaning federal appointments to the court. Most importantly, John Marshall as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And this is after he's already lost the election, but the new president hasn't been inaugurated. The precedent that might come up in our time is that if Trump loses the election in November and the Justice Ginsburg passes during that time, then he and the Republican majority in the Senate, even if they've been voted out of office, still have the constitutional power to appoint a new justice to the Supreme Court.
And if they do, and I don't say there's a certainty that this is going to happen, but it approaches certainty because her health is so poor. This will raise that question of the midnight appointments, but it also, of course, will raise the question of the last year of the Obama administration.
The McConnell refused to appoint the Obama appointee 8 months before.
And his argument was that you don't do it in the last year of an election cycle, and so we'll see if
he will forget that. He will forget that if in December Trump loses, he loses, the Republicans lose, but Ginsburg passes.
Let's go back to the midnight appointments. So John Marshall is the greatest of them. It also was a man named William Marbury, which led to one of the most celebrated court cases in the Supreme Court history. Jefferson, in the famous exchange of correspondence with Abigail Adams in 1804, after the death of his daughter Maria, said that there was one thing and one thing only which really rankled him about the Adams administration, that he couldn't quite find it possible fully to forgive, and that was the midnight appointments. And Jefferson's argument was, look, the country had repudiated Adams, the country had elected the Jeffersonians, it was quite clear, and Adams, Jefferson may have tied with Burr, but Adams was clearly out. Why would Adams do anything during that period when he no longer bore the full legitimacy of the will of the people to hamstring the incoming administration? And Abigail Adams, it can only be said, tore him a new one over that.
She did, and she resented, because she said, you think that we have to apologize. You're the one that has to. You've hired all these scandal mongers against us, and I think that Adams's decision to appoint John Marshall is one of the greatest. The greatest things that Adams did in his career, I think, were to appoint Washington as head of the Continental Army, and Marshall as head of the Supreme Court.
But wait. There's a third. He named Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely. I forgot that. And how could I forget that? But I think that Marshall's the greatest Chief Justice in American history.
Unless you're a Jeffersonian.
He's like the Trojan horse planted in his presidency and administration with a strong Federalist leaning. And you understand why he felt that way. But the notion that it was a last-minute thing, midnight judges, the midnight before he leaves office, that's not true. He was appointed in February, and Jefferson didn't take office until April. And final thing here, maybe final for me, is that the last time that a person who was the former president, who did not win the election, did not attend the inauguration of his successor, was Adams refusing to attend the inauguration of Jefferson. I predict that if Trump loses, he will not attend the inauguration of President Biden.
We shall see. But can I ask you a question about Jefferson's inauguration, Joe?
Sure.
It's always been my impression, whether I'm talking to Clay or talking to President Jefferson.
Do you speak directly to him? You have conversations with him?
I do. I could set one up for you.
Oh, okay.
It's quite an experience. I heartily recommend it. You feel sort of like a chosen one. Anyway, the question is, do you think him appointing Marshall was like a poke in the eye directed at Jefferson?
I don't think it was. I think he had to, like there was this 4-month period of time when the position of Supreme Court justice would be vacant, and he didn't give it a lot of. I don't think he did it in a vindictive way. And in fact, Adams and Abigail went out of the way to welcome Jefferson to the presidential mansion during this interim time, to talk to him. Abigail tried to tell him when the vote was going on in the House who he should have drinks with so that he could woo their votes. And he didn't even know the voters as well as she did. So their treatment of Jefferson, there's nothing vindictive in it. And I don't think that was his major motivation in the appointment of Marshall.
We are out of time, gentlemen, but in the few moments we have left, any last thoughts on this election of 1800 and say what we're going through today?
I have one quick question for Joe. It can answer in a sentence, and then I have the big question I want to ask. And the first question is, not attending Jefferson's inaugural, is that more because of bitterness or because of the death of his son Charles?
I think people don't know it, but you're absolutely right. His own son Charles was dying of a drug overdose, really, and alcoholism in New York, and he didn't get there in time. He died, but that was his main reason for leaving. But he might not have attended anyway.
I agree with that. Okay, so here's the whopper. We saved it for the end so as not to annoy anyone. Why is the election of 2020 arguably the most consequential of your lifetime, Dr. Joseph Ellis?
Because I think that under the presidency of President Trump, we've been taken in a direction that, if it holds true, is going to set the course for the American Republic in the future. And that we have to vote on whether or not we prefer that direction or whether or not we prefer to go forward in a direction that recovers our role in the world as a dominant world power, and that recovers some of the checks and balances originally placed in the Constitution that restrict excess executive power. And abuses of that power, so that whether or not democracy or the republic as we have defined it is going to be transformed or whether it's going to recover its former identity is at stake. And I guess my own position on that issue is clear from the very way I framed it.
A slightly more neutral way to say that, Joe, is that this election is going to determine which direction we're heading. And there are people that want to head in one direction, and there are people that want to head in the other one, but there is no national consensus about that direction at this moment.
I think that's right.
All right. This has been fascinating. We're going to continue this series with Dr. Joseph Ellis. We're going to begin our working our way through the collected works of this extraordinary historian, so watch for that. Thank you all. We'll see you next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.